Hello and welcome back to another TJA Economics video. Today we're going to be looking at the macroeconomic objectives. This is one of the building blocks of A-level or GCSE macroeconomics. You're going to be using it a lot in your essays, in your analysis, in a lot of the work that you do throughout macroeconomics. You're going to have to refer back to the macro objectives, and so it is fundamental that students get this right and sort of understand what they need to do with these macro objectives. So the way that I like to explain the macro objectives to my students is that they're very similar to what doctors can use to measure how healthy a patient's body is. For example, a doctor may look at heart rate, blood pressure, BMI, body temperature, all kinds of things to see how healthy a body is doing and sort of being able to use those to measure how well the body is performing. In a very similar way, us economists use the macro objectives to measure just how healthy the economy is. We use measurements: economic growth, inflation, unemployment, inequality, the trade balance, budget deficit, and the environment in order to assess how the economy is performing and indeed how healthy the economy is doing. On the news, you may hear commentators saying how healthy the economy is, how good the economy is, and what they mean is that they're using these objectives to measure how healthy the economy is. And at A-level and GCSE economics, there are three key things that you need to know about the macroeconomic objectives at this point in order to be able to properly analyse them. The first, number one, how do we measure it? How do we sort of quantify each of the objectives? Number two, what targets do we have? What are we trying to achieve? What do we see as optimal, as best? Number three, how are we actually doing at the moment? How is the UK and certain other countries, how are we actually doing in these objectives? So in this video, I'm going to go through each of the objectives and explain each of those three questions and maybe even look at a few current examples on the way. And so the first one we're going to look at, economic growth, arguably the biggest and to many economists, the most important of the macro objectives. You may well have heard about growth on the news, on the BBC, on all the news channels, and it's all to do with how much is actually being made in our economy. So when they talk about X% growth, that means they're talking about the amount of stuff that we produce has gone up by X%. And we use GDP to measure economic growth, gross domestic product, which itself measures the value of all goods and services produced within our economy in a year. Annoyingly, there is no sort of specific target for growth. We just want it to be positive, but we like to say that it should be, quote, high and sustainable. That's sort of the key idea there. In the UK at the moment, GDP is a bit in flux. In 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdowns, we actually had negative 9.9% growth, the worst in about 300 years. However, in 2021, we're predicted to have growth of positive 7.5%, which would actually be one of the best years since the end of World War II. So, as you can see, our performance at the moment is a bit sort of in flux. And then we come to inflation, which, along with unemployment and growth, is probably another of these sort of headline stats that you're likely to see in the news. And it is vital because it measures by how much the prices of the goods and services, the stuff that we buy, goes up every year. So you can see it's quite important because it really affects our sort of living standards and purchasing power. In the UK, we use CPI, the Consumer Price Index, in order to measure the rate of inflation, which uses a sort of representative average basket of goods and services to see how much the prices have changed over the course of a year. In the UK, the government has set the Bank of England the target of 2% with a tolerance of 1% either side. So as long as within 1 and 3%, you would say that we're on target. But indeed, as of June 2021, the figures came out quite recently, the UK's CPI inflation rate is about 2.5%, which on the surface is good. However, that's actually up from 0.4% earlier this year, and it's only expected to rise even further, so we could see some interesting data coming out of inflation soon. And then unemployment. Again, one of those sort of key headline stats that you're going to see on the news. Simply, what percentage of our workforce, our labour force, doesn't have a job? And there are two key ways in which we can check how we're performing here. The first is the claimant count, and that is sort of done by the government, and it's simply how many people are claiming unemployment benefits. Then the second one, it's a more internationally recognised one, the ILO, the International Labour Organisation's Labour Force Survey. Generally, due to how it's collected, the labour force survey returns a higher number, but like I say, it is more internationally recognised, so we generally use that. Again, similar to growth, we don't really have sort of a target with unemployment. We just want to keep it as low as possible, really. But generally, economists do consider an unemployment rate of about 4% to be optimal. Any lower than that, you start running into issues. Any higher than that, obviously, you've got high unemployment, so it's not good. And then how we're performing at the moment. In the UK, we've actually got an unemployment rate of about 4.8%. So you could say we're doing pretty well. But it remains to be seen how the withdrawal and the ending of the furlough scheme will affect that in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. For inequality, there are a few different ways we could look at this, but generally we like to look at income distribution, which is best measured by the Gini coefficient, which we'll learn about in later topics and you might already know about. And we can use the Gini coefficient to create the Lorenz curve. The long and short of it is that we want our Gini coefficient to be as low as possible, which, as you can see, the UK does pretty well when you compare it to other countries such as South Africa and Brazil. And indeed, we're actually better than some countries like the USA, but we do lag behind sort of the Scandinavian countries. Annoyingly, there is sort of no target for this because different governments will have their own views. It's very sort of subjective, and so it's hard to sort of place a target. Of course, we want society to be more equal if that's possible, but some certain economists would say that a perfectly equal society would mess with incentives, and so different governments will place different emphasis on inequality. The trade balance, or indeed the current account balance to be more precise, is one of the easiest objectives to measure because it's very simply we add up the value of everything we export or sell to the rest of the world, and then we take away the value of everything that we buy from the world or import. In terms of a target, we generally prefer to have it balance out because there are problems if you have a surplus or a deficit. It's probably better to run a surplus, and indeed, countries will probably target a surplus. You probably won't see countries targeting a deficit, but I dare say some have at some point. The UK here, we did not do very well. Since sort of the beginning of the 1990s and definitely in the 21st century, we have started to run an ever-increasing trade deficit. Indeed, as you can see, we actually have the worst trade deficit in the G7, roughly £20 billion a year, or 4% of our GDP, we have in terms of a trade deficit. That's money leaving our economy. And then the budget deficit, which a lot of pupils get confused with trade deficit. Do not make that mistake. Trade deficit and budget deficit, very different things. We just spoke about the trade deficit. Now we're talking about the budget deficit. Simply, the budget is how much the government spends compared to how much it brings in taxation. As you might expect, the target is normally to not have a deficit and run a surplus, spend less than we bring in. The UK, since definitely the 1990s and certainly in the 21st century, haven't run a budget deficit in a while. And indeed, we've run ever-increasing budget deficits, especially with 2008. Then austerity brought it back down. However, with recent events, the coronavirus pandemic, the furlough scheme, all that kind of stuff, the government in the UK and certainly others around the world seem to have sort of not abandoned, but place a lesser emphasis on the budget. And so we're not doing too well. In the UK, it doesn't make for good reading. We borrowed £300 billion in the 2020-21 financial year, which is actually about the same as what we borrowed in the previous 5 years combined. So yeah, we're not doing too great there. And then lastly, we come to the environment, which is actually weirdly enough, the objective that I find students find the trickiest to do proper, full analysis in A-level and GCSE economics, but I find that a bit odd. This is because it's really the objective that came around quite recently, and because of this, there is no real agreement on any of those three key questions, the measure, the target, and the performance that we spoke about. How do we measure it? Do we use CO2 levels, nitrogen oxide levels, deforestation, a combination of multiple levels? How do we do that? How can we set targets when we know that politics plays such a role in combating climate change? The targets seem to change all the time. And then lastly, how are we performing? The UK, for example, has one of the best green energy networks in the Western world, but it's still one of the leading polluters. Does that mean we're doing really well, really badly, sort of middle ground? It's tough to quantify. And like I said, this means that students tend to avoid the environment as an objective. But if you can really sort of nail the objective here, don't be afraid. Examiners love to see sort of variety and outside the box thinking. So the environment can be very useful as an analysis point. And then here we have, and feel free to pause the video if you'd like to sort of get a closer look, the key macro objectives all here with the information that you need at this point. You can see in that second column, we've answered how we measure each of them. In that third column, we've looked at what the targets are for each of them. Then in that last one, I've sort of said how I think the UK is performing in each of them, much like a doctor might use those vital signs. It's very useful to have a sort of table like this, and I would recommend that you maybe create your own or use this one so that you can refer to it in future. So there you have it, the 7 macroeconomic objectives that you need to know for A-level and GCSE economics. Hopefully you found this a useful video and I've helped to iron out any creases in your learning. And indeed, if it has, please do leave a like and remember to subscribe for more economics content in the future. If there's anything else you'd like me to do or any feedback to give, feel free to leave a comment down below or indeed to follow me on Twitter and Instagram to be updated with more economics content. I'll see you next time.